Hi everybody, welcome to today's event. Let's talk about workflow orchestration today. As you know, with data engineering, pipelines are getting larger and larger, and people also call these data pipelines workflows. And we need to integrate more and more tools into these workflows so we can actually solve our business logic, solve our pipelines, get data from the source to the destination. And today we're going to look into Kestra for a good alternative or good project to start with this. I have Russel here today. He is developer advocate for Kestra. He also has a bunch of really cool YouTube videos online on the Kestra YouTube channel. We have linked this also below, so find the links to their GitHub and to the YouTube below in the description. I found this really interesting. Let's bring in Will. And by the way, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. We're going to answer them immediately and get you informed here.
Hello. Well, thank you for the introduction. My name is Will, and I'm a developer advocate at Kestra. So my job is to sort of make sure you can understand not only what Kestra is, but also what orchestration is as a whole and why you might want it, which sort of, I guess, transitions us nicely into the first sort of question is, what is orchestration? Seems to be a question as I talk to more people don't really understand what orchestration is. They sort of, maybe use it or maybe do it, but they don't really understand what it is and why you need it. Now, put simply, I like to think that orchestration is think of it like an orchestra where you've got a bunch of different musical instruments and they all play different sounds and they all they all make different sounds at different times, and you need to try and synchronize them all together. And that's where orchestration is important. In a music sense, you have a conductor who will tell the instruments when they need to come in, at what points, and effectively allow them all to align in harmony. And we need to do the same with our data pipeline. When we're writing Python, if we've got a bunch of different Python scripts, a bunch of different data, it's all great having them all in isolation, but it's when you can get them all working together, working on a schedule, automatically running when data's available. That's where you can really tap into the power of it and build more complicated things. And that's where Kestra sort of comes in to help you understand, make it easy to do that, because orchestration typically has been quite a challenging thing. I imagine, Andreas, you've probably encountered some frustrations with orchestration in the past.
Yeah, that's like for me, back when I started, there wasn't really a lot of orchestration out there, a lot of orchestration tools. You had to do most of the stuff yourself.
Yeah.
And it was really annoying because when there was an error, you had problems that you didn't get notified. There actually something that wasn't working, and stuff was standing still for hours, and then, oh, whoops, something is wrong. And it was complicated to actually build these kind of pipelines or workflows. So
yeah, I've had people who've gone, well, why can't I just use a cron job to like automatically run my code? And it's like, well, you can. There's nothing stopping you. But I've done this in the past where I've had a Python script run on a cron job and it failed for some reason. But I had no idea that it failed, until I checked that the data I was expecting wasn't missing, or I'm looking at my dashboard and the dashboard hasn't been updated for 24 hours, and I'm thinking, what's going on there? Oh, the cron jobs failed because of some reason, and I had no idea. So that's where these sort of orchestrators can definitely help you out a little bit and take some of the frustration away.
True. That's always good to have a good tool that can actually visualize, okay, what's happening, right?
Exactly, which is where Kestra comes in. Could you put the slides up on the screen? And I will give everyone a bit of an overview. So Kestra is an orchestration platform that's designed to make things pretty simple, but also not limit you, because a lot of problems you encounter with orchestration platforms is that sometimes they're really technical and really advanced, but sometimes it's just a bit overkill for trying to run some simple tasks where maybe you just want to run them on a schedule every day, overnight or whatever. It's a little bit complex and hard to maintain. But then you go in the other direction, that you've got something that doesn't have any code at all, and it's all UI based. But then it means that every time you do want to, tap into a little bit more power, you run out of options. You're kind of limited by the platform. And so if you do expand or your pipeline grows, you want to add extra bits to it, you're limited by the platform. And so you kind of go, I don't want to be too down the advanced end, but I also don't want to be limited by a no code tool. And so that's where Kestra can come in here. This is my next slide, where you can do all of it, Kestra. So I'll show you in a demo shortly, but we've got a UI where you can create tasks, you can create schedules, you can build your entire workflow in the UI. And next year, we've actually got we're describing it as the sandbox environment or playground. It's sort of a bit of a TBC, but it'll be proper drag and drop like some of those no-code tools. But when it does that, it generates everything in YAML. So you can then easily jump into the YAML. You can customize it a little bit further. You can, easily, version control it. Or you can write it entirely in YAML if you want. You don't have to touch the no-code editor. You can do the whole thing in YAML. And so it kind of gives you the best of both worlds without limiting you, which also means that you can have people who are super technical and go, I'm just going to write everything myself. And maybe someone who's not so technical come in and maybe add an extra task without having to really understand what's going on.
That's also something that I'm always skeptical, and what I always say is a bit of a downfall of these no-code tools that say, okay, you can do everything with no code. When stuff gets a bit more complicated, they usually are not good, or they don't have the features that you need. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I've had this frustration in the past where you're like, oh, it's going really well. I've got this whole like automation set up, and then you hit a wall and you're like, that's it. This tool doesn't work for me anymore.
It's annoying.
Now, something else that's nice about Kestra is typically a lot of the orchestrators in the market are either kind of orientated around a certain language. Perhaps Python is quite a common one. Apache Airflow is a known one where you write everything in Python, which is great. Python's a great language. It's in fact my favorite language, but Python's not necessarily always the right tool for the job. Sometimes you might be doing something, Kestra being flexible means you don't have to use it for data orchestration. We're going to focus on that today, but sometimes you might want to use something faster. I've spoken to people who have rewritten things in C or in Rust because they're able to process, things a little bit quicker. Whereas, Python starts to struggle a little bit there. So you can, here, Kestra doesn't limit you. If you go, Python's not working for us, we want to change everything, you can easily change out the code. And that's sort of a good discussion of business logic versus orchestration logic. With something like Airflow, where you write everything in Python and you're writing all of your orchestration logic sort of intertwined with your business logic effectively, it makes it quite hard to detach. If you want to go and move to a different language or a different platform, there's a lot more to it than just simply rewriting the core functionality. You've got to then reintegrate it into your orchestrator. Whereas the sort of separation in Kestra allows you the flexibility to maybe change the language or have multiple languages. You can have different bits run in different languages and get the outputs from all of them. It doesn't really matter what language you're using because Kestra will sort of treat them all the same. So it's an interesting sort of perspective.
I always think of this first about the data scientist, right? You have a data scientist or you have a few data scientists in a project. They don't need an engineer to do this. They just need a tool. They know R, they know how to code, and they can't use a tool where they need to learn a different language just to do the orchestration, right? And R is just an example, and the data scientist. But I think that's where this can shine, because people can just use it with the language that they know it.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that makes Kestra easy, it sort of goes on to what we're talking about cron jobs and how they can be a bit difficult to manage. Kestra makes it very easy to visualize what's going on. It's sort of one of my favorite part about Kestra is that everything is very visual. It's very easy to see what's going on, what's happened. When things have gone wrong, it's easy to see why, where, what. And I'll walk you through some of that of our demo as well. But when you're running your workflows, you can easily see at which point each task has started. You can see logs from them. You can see if a task is taking a really long time. And then you've also got this wonderful dashboard that can give you a nice overview of if there's any errors, what's the next scheduled executions plan. So you can easily see what's coming up, but you can also see what's happened in the past. So just a quick overview, you know what's going on. But the main thing is you haven't got to spend loads of time trying to work out, has anything broken? It's one of the main issues I had with cron was you're trying to like find the cron logs and it's like output them to your like the mail on your Linux box and you've got to go and find that. It's not hard. It's just there's a few extra hoops you've got to jump through to actually check that you make sure everything's running. Whereas it's right in front of you in Kestra. You haven't got to go looking for it. It tells you straight away. And you can also set up alerting. So if you want it to let you know, maybe via Slack or PagerDuty or something, you can say, hey, by the way, something's broken. This is the details. It might be something you want to jump in on now, or it could be a good reminder that tomorrow you need to look into that and figure out what went wrong.
I like, it's not a super secret, but I'm a UI guy. I like the visual stuff. So I'm excited to see the dashboard and what you can do. As I said on the YouTube, on a few YouTube videos, I was already saw like the topology view, the Gantt charts. I like this kind of stuff a lot.
That's always my problem when you start building bigger workflows. It can be hard to visualize exactly how it all connects together, especially if you end up having things running in parallel and so on. I like that I can see very clearly in a graph that's generated straight away. Oh, okay, that's how it's working. Or if it's not working as expected, it can help you identify maybe you've put something in the wrong place or you've got yourself a little bit muddled. And I'd like to clarify there is a dark mode too. So while the screenshots here are light themed, there is a dark mode as well. We've also got a bunch of plugins and blueprint examples. So while you can obviously write all of your logic using something like Python, you can interact with the cloud with Python. You can do everything with Python. You don't have to. If you want, you can interact with the cloud directly with the plugins. You could use the plugins to get data for your Python code to run. So you can really customize how you want to use it. And we've also got Git integration. So you can easily set up a workflow that will pull things from a Git repository, such as your workflows and maybe the code you're going to use. You can have that running in Kestra that will pull the data in, then Kestra can start using those workflows automatically without you having to copy and paste everything. And the same for being able to take things in Kestra and push them to Git. So if you're running, a good example I like to use is perhaps you've got a local instance on your laptop. That's where you're writing the workflow, you're testing it and whatnot. Then once you're happy, you might push that to a Git repository, and then you might have an instance in the cloud that's running in production, and you can have that sync from your Git repository once it's maybe in a main branch or something. So it means that you can play around on your laptop and on your local instance without the risk of breaking prod. And then once you're happy, you can then have a workflow set up to move it through GitHub or whatever Git repository you use into your production instance.
That's actually a good segue also to the first question that I saw here.
Okay.
Tan was asking, is there a platform suitable for enterprise? Is it free or open source?
So Kestra is open source in nature. You can go and pull this straight from Docker Hub straight away and be running in 60 seconds. But we do have an enterprise edition as well that has a few additional features. But all of the core functionality that I'm going to show you today will be available in the open source version. So cool. The way I like to think of it is the enterprise edition is basically the open source one with team focused features. So like invitations, role-based access control, single sign-on, those sort of things that if you're just an individual don't really make a difference to you, but if you're working in a team of 10 people are very useful, and so because I'm going to show you a demo as an individual, you're not going to need those things. So hopefully that answers your question. I
find this also very important. Like you need to how do you start usually, right? You want to evaluate a tool, a platform. Right, so you need to have a way of actually working with it, start working with it and finding out, is this the right tool for you, for your use case? And it should be in a way that it's not limited to only a few small features, but it has the broad width of all the features, except the things that you need if you run this with a large team and an enterprise setting. I like that.
Yeah, we've made it easy so that you can go from an open source edition. Maybe you've outgrown it. Maybe, you know, what started as a simple few workflows has grown to something much more advanced. You can easily transition over to that enterprise edition.
Cool.
So you know, you can start off with the open source edition, maybe expand, or you can, like you say, experiment with it, give it a go, see if it's actually the product you want without having to commit to anything. So sort of the beauty of open source, you could say. Cool. So I'm going to just jump into Kestra and show you what a workflow might look like. Now, this is my demo instance. As you can see, a lot of failures. But if I go over to, this is another one I have running, you can see here, I have it zoomed in quite a lot, but if I zoom out, you can see we've got like a nice little overview of the success rate, failures, how many workflows we've got, triggers, which is how we want the workflow to run, whether that's on a schedule or event-based, and we'll look at those shortly. I can easily see on a daily basis the success and failure rate. I can see any executions that are in progress right now. So maybe you've got a few pipelines that take a long time to run, maybe like an hour or two. This can be quite a nice way of being able to sort of see what's going on there. And then we've got on the right here, next scheduled execution. So I can see we've got 3 things here, all with their own schedule. I can easily toggle those on and off if I know that maybe there's a problem or I want to, you know, quickly pause it. I can do that all here quite easily. But I can also click in here and see them a little bit more detail and go, let me click into the workflow, and I can go and have a look at that. And then right at the bottom, we've got all of our logs and executions per namespace. So we can see here, as you can see, got a lot of errors apparently. So might want to investigate what's going on there. Probably me trying to make an example and it not working on first attempt. But yeah, it's quite useful to be able to have this information at your fingertips. I would show you what it looks like on my main instance, but I purged it all the other day for a video. So it shows only the last 30 days is a little bit lackluster.
It's okay.
Apart from the failed here is very high for some reason. So as you can see on the left here, we've got this nice menu here. It gives you your access to all the things you're going to want. The main thing we're going to be looking at is the flows. So here I can see all of the flows or workflows that we have inside of Kestra. I've got 3 in this instance, but if I swap to my normal instance here, you'll see that I've got tons of different ones. I can see their success and failure rate. There's also namespaces, so I can actually filter by namespace. So I can go, I just want to see the ones in my Zoom Camp one, and I can see there's just one workflow in that. So it makes it quite easy to work with. Think of a namespace a bit like a folder. You can organize your flows into different categories in that sense. So we'll go back to the demo. Let's have a look at a workflow. So here I have a very simple workflow that is going to run Python script, and it's going to send a Slack message with the results. Now, there are 2 types of ways you can run Python. You can run it either by writing it directly inside of your workflow, which I know that's probably got mixed opinions. You're probably thinking, why would I want to write Python inside of YAML? Bit, you know, and I agree, it's a bit weird, but sometimes it has its advantages where you only want to write a few lines of code and you don't want to have to create a whole separate file to do that. Perhaps you're maybe just trying to make a request, or in this scenario, I'm just trying to use pandas to sum a CSV file. So, you know, it's not that long. So, but I imagine most people are going to want to write it in a separate file that they can run on their local machine, and then they can call that inside of Kestra. And I've got a demo for that shortly. But yeah, this example is just writing it in line.
Okay. But as you said, if it's just a few lines of code that are easy understandable.
Exactly. It makes it easy because then you've only got one file for the entire workflow. So you can see it all in one place. Now for this Python one, we've got this thing called before commands, which allows us to install dependencies. In our case, we're just doing a few pip installs here. But it's worth noting that this Python task by default runs inside of a Docker container. So you might want to change that and run it as a sub-process. And then you could set up something like a virtual environment if you wanted to install the dependencies that way. But by default, all of the dependencies will be isolated, as each of these script tasks by default will run in a container, which is quite nice, because the other advantage there is you can specify a container image which already has those dependencies rather than having to necessarily install them. So we've got a few on GitHub which have various data tools in Python pre-installed, such as like pandas, NumPy, and so on. So I will often use in my demos the container image that's called, we call it PyData, I think. And then I haven't got to do any pip installs on top of that. So you've got sort of flexibility to choose what you would prefer to do.
I can also imagine that this makes it easy to deploy this on the cloud on some container service, right? Because you have basically one method of deploying, one standard method, and it's always, yes, you can change it to not running as a container, but when you always use a container, it works locally, it works on the cloud. It's easy to actually then transition it from a local deployment to one of the cloud providers.
Exactly. I've had it where I'm developing it on a Mac, but then I can deploy it in Google Cloud on Linux, and I don't have to worry about incompatibility or whatever. I can trust that the Docker container is going to do what it's supposed to, and allow it to sort of move in transit, which makes it quite simple.
Cool.
So moving down, so we actually have a Python library for Kestra, which allows you to interact with your Kestra instance in your Python code. So in our example here, at the bottom here, what we're doing is just simply taking a dictionary here and getting that total revenue value that we've generated from pandas, and then be able to pass that back to Kestra as a value that we can then use in later tasks. So you'll see if I scroll down to the Slack message underneath, I have this thing, we call them an expression, but basically between these two, it's sort of similar to like Ginger syntax, where you can then sort of template things. So here we've got this expression that's asking for an output generated from a task, specifically the task that we have called code. And the code has put it into a category called vars, and then we're doing .the ID, the name of that variable. So in this case, I've called it total, but I could call it whatever I wanted. And so if I was to run this right now, which I can do by pressing execute, first of all, you'll see the really nice Gantt view where you can see that it's pulling that container image, which is just using a Kestra image we have, which is called Kestra Pi. It's installing all those dependencies through the before commands. And the thing is, as I run this more and more, it will be quicker because the container image will be stored locally in cache, so it won't have to pull it every time. We can see that it was successful. And if I go down now, we can see the Slack message has sent the value that was generated. And if I go to the logs, I can see this as well, and I can filter by different levels. So if I want to see any warnings, luckily we didn't have any, but I could obviously fake an error so that we could see that. The topology view here, which we sort of brushed over, helps me visualize how long each task ran, which ones failed. We can see that there was a schedule set up to run this automatically every day. Now, the exciting bit is the outputs tab. Now, in here, we can filter by the different tasks and see all the outputs generated by them. As you can see here, we've got under code, which is the Python task. Under vars, that's where it's the Python code where we use the library is putting all of those variables. So if we generated loads and just put a massive dictionary straight in here, we would see it all appear here. And so I can see that value there. And now I can use that in any task I want. Maybe I could send that in a Slack message, but perhaps I want to do something else with that. And I can also generate files. So we'll show in the next example, we'll get Python to generate a CSV file, and then we can use that in later tasks as we need.
How would you install this, right? Because now you have Kestra running here, you created a workflow. This is a simple Python workflow. How would you, where would you install Kestra and then run this code? What's the simplest example?
If you were to get started, I would recommend that you install it on your local machine using Docker. We've got an example on the website that runs it with an embedded database that just runs in your memory, which does mean if you turn off spin down the container, you do lose everything. But it's a really quick way of being able to jump straight into Kestra and start playing around with it without having to do much more setup. My recommended way, though, for local development is using a Docker Compose file. And in that, you can then specify the configuration for your Kestra file. So that means you can specify what kind of database it uses. And we have an example on the website that you can just copy and paste straight into a Docker Compose file, and it will work straight away. But then you can specify a few extra things, like if you want how you want maybe what port number you want it to run on and other things, and you can add secrets and so on. So that's definitely the easiest way to run Kestra, and that still allows you to then use these containers. We call it, I think the technique is Docker inside of Docker. So Kestra itself is running in Docker, but then you will get containers that Kestra is producing, such as the Python code one, and you can also run containers. So you can pull a Docker image and then just run it as a part of your workflow as well, if you would want to do that. So,
so that means if, let's say I have a small deployment also on AWS, and I could just get the image and then run this on ECS as an image, as a container.
Yeah, exactly.
And then start working with it.
Yeah, exactly. And we're starting to work on getting it on those marketplaces as well. So you can just sort of one-click install and it will just appear there. So you don't even have to interact with Docker. So
cool.
The idea is that if you want to install Kestra, there'll probably be a way that will suit your needs. You won't have to follow the 2 different ways of doing it. There's many options.
But you could also say, now I have it running within ECS as a container, and every Python script that I start here runs as a separate ECS task. Then is that possible?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I know we do it with Kubernetes, where a lot of our sort of more enterprise customers will deploy Kestra in Kubernetes, and they basically have each of these tasks spin up their own separate pods.
Okay.
So they can sort of manage it a little bit easier in that sort of sense.
All right, cool.
Thanks. So with that, we've had a look at a simple example here that's just running a little bit of Python. And we are using that output here in the Slack here, but I'm going to look at a slightly different example. We'll go to this dynamic one first. So we'll go to the topology view. So before we even look at the code, we've got a pretty good visualization of what's going on here. We've got a schedule at the top here. And then on the right here, we've got the Python code, which we can see with the icon there. We've got a Slack message. And then at the bottom here, we have an S3 upload. Now, you'll notice there's this little extra icon here. It says task condition. Now, we can decide whether we want this to run or not at the start of our execution using a thing called inputs. Now, if I click on editor, you'll see at the top of our workflow, we've got 2 inputs here. And this allows us to pass data in at the start of our workflow's execution to change what will happen. So in this scenario, if I press execute, you'll see I'll get a URL. So if I want to change the dataset URL, I can do that. Perhaps a better example would be I've been working on a demo recently that uses different taxis data sets, and the data are all in the same format. It's just different data. And so you might want to just specify which of those data sets you want this to use rather than having to then manually change the workflow. You can just pass it in here. And with the schedule, which we can see at the bottom here, you can actually pass in input. So you might say at 1 a.m., run the workflow with this input, but at 2 a.m. run it again with a different input, so you can stagger them a little bit and get separate it a little bit if you prefer to do that. You can also set a bit of validation too. So for this bottom one, which is a discount amount, I don't want the number to be, I want it to be between 0 and 1, so I can specify there a little bit as well, which makes it a little bit easier. And so you can see here that I can easily change that. But if I try and change that to like 4, we'll see that it just changed it to the maximum number to prevent any issues. So you can sort of bulletproof your workflows as well a little bit to make sure that people aren't passing in values that aren't valid. And if you are wondering, you can put regexes for strings. So you can get very specific there if you want to. Moving down, we've got our tasks. And this is where the topology view starts to get a little bit different to the last example. Now, we've got 3 tasks here. We'll look at those in a bit more detail, but underneath we have this errors block, which is just like tasks, but this time, this is what's going to run if we get an error. So if something errors out, for example, I could remove the I could put in random letters and numbers for the AWS access key, so it just doesn't work and doesn't authenticate. It will fail, and then it will run this, which is quite good because then you might want to have some tasks if it fails to maybe spin down the workflow. Maybe it's set up some maybe it's turned on something that you need to then turn off, or in most scenarios you want to send an alert or a notification to say something's gone wrong, come and have a look. So here I'm using a different Slack task. This one's called Slack execution, and this will basically give a Slack message with a bit of a visual idea of what's gone on in that execution. We can actually it's here. So you can see here that it looks a little bit like this. You can see it tells me that which namespace it was in, the flow ID, the status, and I can click on it and it will give me, I can show you that actually. If I click on it here, you'll see it it brings me into Kestra. Obviously I'm not logged in. So let me fix that. So you can see here, I get straight to that execution. I can see the error it encountered. I can maybe look at the logs for a little bit more information and find out why there was a problem. So quite useful that you can have that flexibility. And so that's why in the topology view, we see it sort of splits it out because it might run at any point, regardless of the task. It could happen if the Python script fails because we've got a syntax error in it, or maybe something doesn't authenticate. So quite useful. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm asking myself is, okay, when I want to create these tasks, what's the quickest way of doing this? Do I just click on the right on the topology and basically select one of the things that are a task that I want to do? Or do I go somewhere to your documentation and then do a bit of research and copy in a template? Or how is that? How are people usually doing this?
Yeah, so it's sort of a couple ways you can build workflows. I'll show you if you were to write it in YAML. Let me just add a simple log task here. If I was to type a log task in here, you can see that every task needs an ID and a type. And when I type in type, you can see I get this huge auto completion here, which I can actually expand of every task. So if I write in Python, for example, I get a nice summary of the different Python things. Maybe I want to type in AWS. So now I've got all the different AWS things. I go, oh, actually, AWS upload is exactly what I was after. But the thing that you encounter in any programming language is, so that's great, but what other properties are there? Now I have to go and find a documentation page. But Kestra does this with, we have a built-in docs. And when I click on this task, you'll see, if I save it maybe, hang on, let me give it a refresh. So when I click on different tasks, it should automatically, I can give you it with my backup instance over here. I can show you what it should look like. So here, when I click on the different tasks, you'll see it automatically brings me the documentation for that task. So if I was to go and create a new task, so I know I need an ID, so we call that log. I can put type in here and call that log. And then here I can easily see, here's an example. I know that I can see here that message is required, but level is not required, but I can see possible values that I could put in. So it makes it really easy. So one of the things I always find frustrating is sometimes, especially if you've only got one screen, you need to have like the code on one side and like the documentation on the other, and it sort of feels like you're running out of screen space a little bit. It's quite nice having it.
And also the looking around. That's one of the annoying things, that you know what you want to do, but then you need to search in the documentation, then you go over and then you put it in, then I'm not sure, then let's go back into the documentation, which is super annoying.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, so I'm just going to restart my demo instance.
Yeah, sorry for...
I don't know why it stopped working, but but I have a backup because sometimes this happens. So so another cool thing about writing your Python code in line is you can actually put expressions straight. Oh, sorry. Let me take a step back. You asked about ways that we can write code, and another way is using that topology view. So here you can see there's little plus icons at the different stages, and I can press plus, and just like we had with the YAML editor, I can type in things here like Python, and I can see that, or AWS, and so you get very similar. And if I press on AWS upload, for example, I can do that here, and then press. You can see now I get to. It asks me for an ID, bucket, from, and I can see all of this just like the documentation, and it gives me all of the optional parameters too, with little help icons to kind of tell me what it's actually expecting in that box. Because something that's quite frustrating is it goes expires, and you're like, okay, but what does that actually mean? In some of the like property names on their own don't always necessarily make any sense. And you can also click documentation, and obviously you can see them.
That's awesome.
So it's all integrated. You don't have to jump between the docs. I can also see the YAML myself, so I don't have to necessarily, I can sort of switch between them. So if I add an ID here of upload, I can then go to source, and we can see that it's added upload. I can put that my bucket is called open source example. I can see, it just makes it easy that you can, if you want to write it in code, you can. If you don't, you also don't have to. And we're hoping to get a low code editor that will allow you to sort of drag and drop them a little bit more. Like I can move the tasks around, but you can't change the order of them as easily.
But does that mean when I add in the topology a new task, this automatically then on the left you see this in the code, right?
Yeah, I'll do it with the log example.
It's okay. It's okay. This is something that I think is super important, because let's say you want to synchronize this with GitHub, right? Then you can actually synchronize the code, and it will then afterwards generate the topology, and like that topology and the code part, the YAML part is actually synchronizing. That's cool.
Yeah,
okay, that's cool.
And it actually creates its own revisions as well. So you'll see that apparently I've only ever made one revision for this code. But if I was to, I don't know, change my Slack message here to be in general 2 and press save, we'll see under revisions, it's already made a new revision. And we can see that here at the bottom here, the change, I can see it line by line too, if I would prefer. So every time you press save, it creates a revision. So you can easily roll back if you want to, without having to, go, oh no, I've accidentally, this doesn't work, I want to roll back. You don't have to think about it. So we often recommend that people still version control in Git. It's what they're used to. It allows them to easily integrate into other systems as well. But Kestra will do that revision for you as well. So you've got the best of both worlds. I'll change that back to general.
Does the quick?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I have many questions. Does that mean you don't necessarily need to code here in the Kestra UI? You could also use your VS Code and then just basically synchronize that file with Kestra.
100%. We've got a VS Code plugin, so it will give you that syntax highlighting to say, this plugin is missing a required property or whatnot. Because a common problem people have with YAML is that it's really easy to get like an indentation wrong or something like that. And it's really frustrating, because then you're sat there like, oh, YAML's a bad language because it's really easy to make typos. Kestra's pretty aggressive when it comes to editing it. Like if I accidentally indent this like slightly wrong like that, you'll see immediately it's already getting crazy at me. It will not let me save because the YAML is invalid. And so you can be pretty certain that you've got it in the correct format, because it will get quite angry at you very quickly, which is always nice when the syntax highlighting is quick and quite clear about what's going wrong.
That makes sense.
Another way that you can get started with building workflows is using our blueprints. So we've got a bunch of blueprint examples to help you get started. We've got them in all sorts of different categories. And so I'm going to go to Python, for example. And as you can see here, we can see this one here. If I click into it, this is going to run specific tasks on only on business days for a specific country. So I can see it's just running a Python task. This one's a commands one, so it's going to call an actual file. And we can see that it's passing in an expression to that file for it to use. But we can see at the bottom here, the schedule here has got a cron expression for those different things it's looking for. And I can see the Python code example too. And if I want to use that, I just have to press the use button, and it's just created me a brand new workflow ready to go, and I can press save, and I'm now ready to use that. So I found when I first got started with Kestra, coming in here, there's also a bunch of getting started ones. So here I can go, I want to see what if I select, I can click in here and say like file processing, how can I do that? And here's a good example that does a bunch of stuff here. And I go, that's actually not what I want to do, but it's a good starting basis that I can then modify to suit my needs. So kind of helps you get started. And a common problem that people have is the cloud platforms are quite complicated. Especially with AWS, naming things all sorts of random things. So you can come in here and you can see like, oh, okay, I want to use AWS. Here's an example of how I can get set up with AWS without having to figure it out from just the docs. You've got this example that you can.
That's cool. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's a way how I always like to work. Like find an example, and then extend the example, because then you have a starting point.
Exactly.
That's also what I say to people in my academy when it comes to learning new tools. Like, here's the starting point. Now this allows you to go to the next step, and that's cool that you built this in here.
Yeah,
nice. I like it.
And it's all stored on GitHub, so people are welcome to make pull requests. Maybe they've come up with an example that they think is quite useful. They can just make a pull request and add it straight in. So I actually found, before I actually started at Kestra, I found a couple little things that maybe weren't working quite right. So I just made pull requests to add them in, because I wanted to use them. So I found it quite useful. So going to back to this workflow, I've called it dynamic for a reason. We've got these input values here that we can then use in our workflow once we press execute. And we can use them using an expression. But the cool thing about writing the Python code directly inside of our workflow is we can just put the expression straight into the Python code. Now, obviously, this doesn't work if you have a separate file. And there are key ways to be able to pass it in. My normal recommendation is using an environment variable. You can just, when you spin up that Docker container, pass these inputs in as environment variables. Also useful for then writing your code locally on your local machine, because you can then just set those environment variables in your local machine. You don't have to do anything special. But if you're writing a short bit of code, like here, I'm passing that URL, which has our data set in it, straight into the Python code. So I can easily change that without having to hard code it into the Python. And it's the same here with that discount number. I can pass that in here and check it in an if statement, whether the number is greater than 0 or not. And then I can use it again here to calculate that discount. So it's quite nice that you can sort of blend Kestra into your Python code without having to necessarily do anything crazy. But if you do want to write separate files, you can do it with environment variables, but that doesn't make you Kestra bound per se. Everything you're doing there is just normal Python practice. There's nothing that's Kestra specific. So it's quite nice.
That fits here to one question from Karthik. How are these secrets managed, right? For like external tools.
So I see that you probably noticed that we have a secret expression here.
Exactly.
Now, there are kind of two ways you can do this. In the Enterprise Edition, which I'm currently in now, the teams, when you go to your namespace, you'll have an option here called secrets, and you can just add them in at the UI and manage them this way. We have a key value store, which people in the open source edition use similarly. Obviously, it's not encrypted, but it does allow you to basically store them so that they're not hard coded into your workflow, which does allow you then to version control it without the risk of version controlling your secrets. In the open source edition, you can add them to your Docker Compose file as environment variables. So you can base64 encode them, put them in as an environment variable, and then you can access those inside of Kestra. So you've got the best of both worlds. A little bit more fiddly because you have to then restart Kestra when you add those environment variables. But if you're planning to, get a Google Cloud Service account JSON, you can add that into your Docker Compose file, leave it there, and then you can just rely that that's going to work inside of Kestra. But the Enterprise Edition here gives you that nice extra with the UI where you can manage it here. And then, it's exactly the same for both editions. You can then access that expression just like this inside of your workflow, which is quite nice. And then another thing that's nice about the Enterprise Edition is You can set it up to work with a secret manager. So you can use maybe one of the cloud ones to manage your secrets. And if you have separate different tenants, you can have each tenant use a separate secret backend. So if you really want to make sure that you're separating those environments, you can make sure you can do that as well. So it gives you sort of trust that everything is separate and there's definitely no overlap.
Awesome. Wow. Okay, so everything's there. Like, okay.
Exactly.
Cool.
So in our Python code here, after this if statement, we are actually generating a CSV file. And as you can see at the top of the Python code here, I have a property called output files, and I can specify, I can use a regex to say like anything like star dot or asterisk dot CSV. But in this case, I know I want a file called processed orders dot CSV. And all it's doing is basically adding a column that has all of the discounted prices. And then it will generate a new CSV with that data. Now I can use that data here in my S3 upload. And as you can see, I've passed it in as an expression using that similar format to earlier with the outputs dot, the name of the task dot. And then as we saw from the outputs tab, we had something called output files. And then I can just access it using a key value, sort of putting the key in here to get that value. And then that means the S3 plugin will get access to my file and we'll upload it. And if I actually run that now quickly, and I'm going to give it a 10% discount, we'll see that it's going to run my code like so. It's going to spin up the container. We'll see it's going to run that. We can see we've got a Slack message, which if I go over to here, we'll see I just got a Slack message with the value in it. And then we can see it did upload it to S3. And if I go over to S3, hopefully it hasn't logged me out. We can see that just now it has actually uploaded a file, and we can actually open the file and see that when I open it like so, it's going to open in numbers, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, well, that's fine. Yeah, you can see here that our CSV file now has a discounted total. So if you do want to upload it to some object storage, you can do that.
Cool. Wow.
But you can also upload it to something like BigQuery as well, if you would prefer to. So this next example is the same thing, but expands a little bit further. So again, what we've done now is the Python code is all in a separate file. So instead of having it inside of the workflow, perhaps the Python code is getting a little bit longer, a bit more complex. Maybe you've got multiple Python files. You don't want to put that inside of your workflow. That gets a little bit messy. So what we can do is we can have a file format like we expected like we would, expect to run on our local machine in Kestra. And as you can see here, I've put that Python code in straight away here. Now, a few differences are we're using environment variables now to access those input values rather than putting the expression straight in. But this does allow us to then run it locally on our machine. So, bit of benefit to both. But this is, still completely vanilla Python code. We're not writing anything that's Kestra specific here, but this runs in Kestra. So what's changed? That's the key thing. So here we're just like running a command here to run our Python file, but you can run any command here you like. So if you're using something like Poetry, you could run Poetry here as well to set up your environment as you would want. We've got the Slack message. And then down here, we've got BigQuery. And we're actually using the BigQuery task here to load that new CSV file straight into BigQuery without having to write our own custom logic using Python or a language of our choice. And as you can see here, I've specified some of those properties in BigQuery. I've got my service account that I need to be able to authenticate. And I have this run if property. And so this is quite nice to basically say, don't run this task if this input is not true. And this input is the same input that we had in the Python code to generate the CSV file. So effectively what we're saying is, if you're not generating the CSV file, don't bother trying to run BigQuery because there is going to be no file to upload. And that's why if I run this now without actually adding a discount, you'll see that it's going to run the Python code like we expected. It should run that no problem. It's going to send the Slack message, but then it's going to skip over the BigQuery part. And we can see that it specifically skipped it, and it's not just vanished from this view, which is quite nice. So I think let's run this and see this add everything to BigQuery.
Yeah, cool. Can you show the topology for this?
Yes, that is a good, yeah. So here's the topology. So here we've got, it's very similar to the last one. I can actually, I wonder why, I'm actually curious now. I'll have to ask our team why the error block is on the right-hand side, but earlier it was on the left.
True.
Yeah, exactly, you know? But yeah, we can see that task condition is this expression here to check that input value. So yeah, let me run this, and I'll run it actually so that when I press execute, we'll go to the topology view and we can see that this task is currently running. We can see it's successful. Nice. We can see it's all moving down, and the same for the logs here. We can see, cool. If I go to the Gantt view, we'll see that BigQuery did in fact run. And if I go over here and give this a refresh, we can see that this was the one I had open. So we can see, preview the data, and we can see that this was the data that is generated with a 10% discount. From my basic maths, that looks about like 10% less. Yep. From a guess, that looks about 10% less. But yeah, we can then now use BigQuery. Now, a good question is, Anna and I were working on some examples of the New York taxi data. And we're doing two examples, one that runs it in Postgres on your local machine and one that runs it in BigQuery. And a question gets asked often of like, why should I use a cloud platform to do this when I could just do it locally? Well, Anna found out the hard way this morning because when she tried to load all this data into Postgres, she ran out of memory and storage on her local machine because she was copying tables, and her poor little laptop did not enjoy trying to do everything. And that's where something like BigQuery takes all the hassle away and allows you to use all those resources. We didn't have any issues running it on BigQuery, but the data sets were massive. And as soon as we started to copy data around it, it got quite messy.
Yeah, it's always the danger. Thank God for the cloud.
Yeah, exactly. We can see some of in the outputs tab here, we can see some of the data generated by BigQuery. We can see some metrics generated, so we can see how long it took to do it, how much data as well. So quite useful to see it generated 100 rows, which makes sense because the CSV file had 100 rows in it. It kind of gives you a nice overview of Kestra. Hopefully that's given people a bit of an idea of how Kestra can take your simple Python code and can make it run a little bit easier, help you expand it. If you've got any questions about it, do let us know. I'd love to hear. Yeah,
let us know your questions in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to just continue asking. One thing that there is a question a bit about ETL, and we're going to get to that in a second. Most of these things, or basically all of these things, were basically ETL, right? We're extracting the data, or we're creating the data from somewhere, and we're putting it somewhere. Like, how would can this work with some kind of a streaming process?
Yeah, we've got plugins that so there's sort of two ways you can do it. You can set up a trigger such as like a Kafka trigger, so that if you have a Kafka stream and it's streaming data in, you can have Kestra start the workflow when that data is available in the stream. And there's other plugins for other ones too. So that's sort of one sort of way you can do it. Another way is you can have a workflow that then starts connecting to your Kafka stream and can get the data that way. But you can create your workflows to be event driven. All the ones I showed you today were schedule based, so we'll run on a routine, but that may not work for you. Maybe you want it to run when the data is available, and there are plugins to allow that too.
Cool. Okay. Let's get to a few questions. There's a basic one. What is a key difference between automation and orchestration? How many ETL tools are there? How many ETL tools? That's like maybe in connection with Kestra. Whoops. The difference between automation and orchestration. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, they are very similar. There is a lot of crossover. The way I like to put it is that automation is normally kind of a simpler version of orchestration. You might be just simply doing something a little bit more linearly. Maybe you're just saying, on a schedule, run this thing. So an automation would be like if you had a smart home where you wanted it to turn the lights on at 6 o'clock. That's a very linear thing. It's going to do that thing and it's going to finish. It's not necessarily going to alert you if there's errors. It's not necessarily going to sort of you're not necessarily going to have something else trigger when those lights turn on. Whereas orchestration is sort of that and more. So, for example, you might have error handling that is listening in for errors. So, for example, something I didn't talk about today is a flow trigger. So, you can have a workflow start based on conditions of other workflows. So, if a workflow finishes with a failure, you can then tell a workflow dedicated to error messaging to start. Or perhaps you want it so that if a certain workflow finishes and produces data, this next workflow will automatically start once that data is available. And so orchestration is sort of where it's a little bit more event driven, and you might also have a few more things coming into play. So not necessarily just on a schedule, but you might have it multiple things that might trigger it to start, not necessarily just one. So yeah, automation is orchestration is effectively like automation on steroids. Is sort of but yeah, it can sort of vary depending on what you're doing. Hopefully that makes sense.
I think so. We haven't really talked about basically the tools / platforms that you can integrate, right? That you can work with. There are a lot, like you said, 650 services or something in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Like, who is creating this? Is this some kind of a open source thing that people can actually create their own connectors, or how is this managed?
Yeah, so all of our plugins, other than a couple of enterprise ones, are all open source. And at the moment, we manage all of them. However, there's nothing stopping you building your own workflow. So we've had a few people who've gone, I really want this very niche thing, or maybe they want a plugin that connects with their own system. So they've built that. And it's worth noting that Kestra's built in Java. So all of these plugins are built in Java. They're effectively API wrappers, a lot of them, where they're effectively just giving you the nice syntax of Kestra, of being able to just define those properties and with the autocomplete and whatnot. But then they're making those requests for you without you having to then add that logic into your code. But yeah, if you want to build your own workflow, your own plugins, then you can do that too. We've got a bunch of documentation to help you figure that out. But the sort of other side of it is you don't have to build it in Java or as your own plugin. You could write your own logic in any language you like and then just tell that file to run. So there's sort of two ways you can go about sort of building your own custom connector.
That makes sense, yeah. Of course. What else was there? The question, I don't think we need to answer this question one-to-one. Like, the question was, what is ML workflow orchestration? I would rephrase this as like, how are people using this for machine learning?
That's a good question. We've had a few people who've used it to effectively, like a sort of a high level answer is people have got data, they've got these large language models, they want to keep training them, and they might have a workflow that is running that training process, whatever that might look like. And so once more data is available that they can use, they might pass that in. So even if their training process is entirely just a Python script, they might have Kestra trigger that process to start and help it sort of receive the data for it to then train off of. Or you might use it to be able to connect to a cloud platform that's got training data available to be able to then pull that over to the file, the code that's going to train on that data. So you can sort of use Kestra, sort of like we said earlier, to connect all those different things together so they're all in one place.
Okay. That makes sense. I don't know. You have how's the thing called in AWS? I always forget. SageMaker, right? Isn't SageMaker for machine learning? I think so.
I think so, yeah.
So you could basically have your process in SageMaker where you train, then use Kestra to actually first get the new data in, prepare everything, and then once it's there, you say, okay, now let's trigger the training process. and basically manage if this is working and it's really, okay, that makes sense.
Exactly.
There's a question from Mark. I do have a question. Is there a way to generate workflows dynamically?
Well, I mean, it depends. I guess it depends exactly what you mean. But if you want, you can generate workflows using the API. So if you want to add them, programmatically, you can do that. You can generate them with API requests. You can also completely manage Kestra with Terraform. So if you want to, add workflows, remove them, change them, you can have Terraform manage that whole process. If you mean more like how can I create workflows with different things, I guess you could use the API. You could have a workflow that generates workflows, and it makes API requests to generate those with different input values. So Kestra was designed with an API first sort of intention. So it means that everything you do with Kestra, you can also do from the API. So you can, we've had some people they've built custom UIs on top of Kestra so that people on their team can do the very niche things they need to start workflows or change values all from one screen. We've tried our best to obviously implement feedback where we get it to make the UI achieve those things. But if you've got a really niche scenario where having a custom dashboard that controls Kestra, you can do that with the API. So or Terraform.
I'm an API fan, so okay. That is really good to hear. That's really good. Yeah, I saw also on the. By the way, Mark, let us know if this answered your question. I also saw in one of your YouTube videos you had basically the monitoring or the visualization through, one was with Prometheus, where we saw the tasks that were running, and also with Grafana, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, actually, I see Mark's just replied saying, I meant generating flows from different inputs. You could totally use the API of having a workflow with different inputs, pass that to an API request to then generate different workflows. Hopefully that's what you mean. But yeah, going to the Prometheus and Grafana part. Yeah, so Kestra produces a bunch of different data about everything that's going on a Prometheus endpoint. So you can then plug that into Prometheus and then start collecting that data over time. What I learned was when I made that video, I had a rough idea of the sort of data that Kestra made, but there's a lot of it. And so I made a very basic example in it. But then I spoke with the dev team to understand how they use Prometheus. And we've got a basic version of the cloud that's running. We use that for some demos, some testing and whatnot. And we have our own Prometheus dashboard to monitor that. And the amount of data that you can produce to monitor not only just workflow, execution success and whatnot, but you can also get like actual log metrics. So if you generate, like we saw in that BigQuery example where we were generating a bunch of metrics, you can pull that data from Prometheus as well and build dashboards in Grafana with it. So there's lots of options to be able to really, if you want to build a dashboard, it's sort of like, we're not going to limit you. It's more your imagination's going to limit you. The data will be there and available, rather than the other way around where it's like, there's like, a couple, endpoints that produce some data, but it's not that useful. I'm looking for this really niche thing. So yeah, I was surprised by how much data you can get from here.
That's cool. It's also like, I'm thinking from a perspective of companies already have stuff, right? They maybe already have Grafana because they monitor certain other services, and they don't want to now use another UI. They want to have everything in one place and build their dashboards there. And okay, if you get all the metrics, and that's really super cool.
Yeah, no one wants to have to jump between a bunch of different dashboards. It's very unlikely that Kestra is the only tool that you're hosting in your infrastructure.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why I also like the API. Basically, the API system is the wrong word. Basically, that you can use APIs to interact with Kestra, because it's not going to be the only tool. You also have other things in your deployment that can then natively interact with it. That's super practical. Will, what's coming 2025?
Yeah, so 2025 is pretty close, actually. It's only like 2 weeks away. I know, crazy. We've got two sort of main big things we're hoping to get launched. The main one is a cloud version. So right now, you could only run Kestra locally. It's very easy to run locally, but perhaps you don't want to run it and manage it locally or deploy it. You want to be able to just sign up to a cloud instance and have it run for you and focus on building the workflows rather than managing the infrastructure for the workflows. And so we're hoping towards the end of next year to have that publicly available. We've got a very basic version at the moment that we've got a couple of sort of people playing around with. But yeah, we're going to start to get that ramped up and ready for next year. So stay tuned for the launch of that. Cool. And then the other thing for 2025 is more effort into that low-code editor. So a lot of people who use Kestra primarily use the YAML editor, which is great. I mean, it's very useful. The autocomplete's really nice. But we want to add even more enhancements to that low-code editor. At the moment, you can't quite do everything with it. You can do, 90% of the tasks with it, but there's a few things that you can't quite do. And we want to make it feel a little more natural to use, a bit more drag and drop. So, it's like some other tools you might have used, like maybe NAN or Zapier, where they're very drag and drop into sort of focused. But it will still generate the YAML. So we haven't really got a name for it yet, either like Playground or Sandbox, but we really want to go all in on that whole no code, low code, full code.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it's also very intuitive then when you have a task or a part of a workflow and you just want to move it on in a different point of the workflow, that you can just drag and drop it there. Of course,
exactly.
That would be super cool.
We just released a new feature called apps, which basically allows you to create like a form to run your workflows. The intention is we've got some users who where they've got non-technical people. Well, they're not necessarily non-technical, but they're the people who want to use the workflows. They want to get the data out of them, perhaps maybe just to run in a spreadsheet or whatever, but they want to get the CSV file out of Kestra, but they don't want to have to deal with all of the, the fact that there's all of the workflow logic and properties. They want to be able to pass some inputs in like we did at the execution, wait for it to finish and get their outputs and do whatever they need to do. And apps allows you to build a custom form to do that. So you can see the workflow run, but you never see the orchestration logic. So it is sort of that sort of part one of this sort of going down the low code route of being able to suit teams where you can have someone build a very technical workflow, but then a non-technical person can interact with it and get what they need out of it.
Makes sense. As long as you keep the functionality as it is right now, right? That you can go in, you can edit the YAML files, you can, if you want to edit add Python code there and have all the control of what's going to happen. And the other thing is just making it easier for people, basically having accessibility to the whole workflows, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. Will, thanks for this talk, this demo. I'm impressed. It's really,
I'm glad.
really awesome.
I'm glad. And if anyone has any questions about Kestra, you're more than welcome to join our Slack community. We're pretty active in there. So if you want to learn a little bit more about Kestra or get involved with the community, then I'll be keeping an eye out.
Yeah, or also find Will on LinkedIn, for instance.
Yeah. I'm always, I love posting little snippets as well. So nice. Come connect with me on LinkedIn.
Yeah. And again, in the description of this video, there are a few links to the GitHub of Kestra, and you're going to find all the information there. And I'm guessing also the Discord, right?
Yeah, there'll be links to, all of that will be in the bottom. So GitHub, Slack, and the YouTube channel should be there.
Cool. All right. Thanks again, Will.
Thank you.
Have an awesome day, everybody. Thank you for joining this and all the great questions. And then we see each other in the next event. Bye.